And we want to download that information on everyone here to inspire you all to create some sparks. That's the topic of this one, our spark, seeding and growing climate economy entrepreneurship. You've got 3 climate economy entrepreneurs that are practicing the field, have done this themselves, have inspired others to do it, have funded others to do it, and have made incredible things happen. So I'm going to quickly go to my left, let them introduce themselves in 1 minute to tell you just a quick, brief bio. Then we'll come back and we'll have Josh lead us off with a presentation.
Hi everyone, I'm Josh Whiton, and I'm an ecotech entrepreneur and rabble-rouser in general. I've done a lot of things from a public transit technology company to urban farming, to investing, to tech stuff, blockchain stuff, all that great stuff. So, and I'll be speaking in just a few minutes. I'll save it all for there.
Now, I have to just augment one thing because very few people have been recognized by a president of the United States by anything. And just to mention that Obama did name you a White House champion of change. So thanks for your modesty, but that's kind of a big deal.
I was going to mention it later, so no modesty really. But thank you.
Hello, Danny Kennedy. I was up on that panel earlier, so just to remind you, I'm the Managing Director of the California Clean Energy Fund, somewhat of a serial entrepreneur in the solar industry. Started Sanjivani, helped get some other companies going like Mosaic and Power Hive and Sunergize and things with the word sun in them, as my wife thinks. And an incubator called Powerhouse out of Oakland, California, which kind of led me to running this fund and network of incubators and accelerators called the California Clean Energy Fund. Before that, long career in energy policy and advocacy work around the world, hence the funny accent. I'm Californian born, but spent most of my time on the other side of the Pacific, like the bottom end of the Pacific.
Jigar Shah. I'm a president at Generate Capital, and you guys have heard way too much from me. So.
Hey, but you know what people haven't heard? You mentioned your reference to Norwich. So how long did you spend in Norwich, and when was that?
I was there for, I think, 18 months. It was the end of 1996 to the beginning of 1998.
Excellent.
So.
Excellent. Always happy to have some Vermont roots in folks. So, Josh, if you want to take us through your presentation, share some success with us, will you? Great.
Well, I hope you all had a great week at Burning Man last week. You're looking pretty fresh, considering. So up on the screen, I have I hate doing slides, and I think, well, I'll do one slide. I'll just put the Earth up there because it puts everybody in a good state, and it's a good reminder. This is Earth. It's the only living biosphere in the known universe. It's pretty special. It's also dying. That's a problem. And one of the reasons it's dying is because of this thing called the economy. So it's this thing we all made up together. It's a squiggly line. We need to see it going up and to the right all the time or we get upset. And if aliens were watching us and going about our business, they would conclude that we were turning the living biosphere into garbage and cash as quickly as we can. We have a backup plan, don't worry. It's called Mars. The genius of this is that we can leave the dying planet of Earth for an already completely dead planet. Brilliant. So I'm actually all for colonizing Mars. I just like to remind people that to actually do that will mean mastering the protection and regeneration of ecosystems. And there's no place you can learn how to do that except for Earth. That's convenient. So, is there an opportunity for the climate economy or whatever you want to call it? Absolutely. Right now it's a thing that is mostly chewing up the Earth and spitting out garbage, and it needs to become a thing that regenerates the Earth. So, is there opportunity? Yes. It's pretty much just opportunity at this point. The whole damn thing is opportunity, okay? So let's get busy. And to help encourage us all that it is possible, I am going to get to share a little bit about the experiences of my past. And one of them that I'll focus on is that when I was just a college graduate, 23-year-old, I started a public transit technology company. And what that means is I noticed that the public transit systems of the world were pretty dumpy. And they were nothing like the amazing video games I was playing on my computer. And I realized that the technology in the world was not evenly distributed by any stretch of the imagination. And if I could just bring an ounce of technology to the public transit world, we could really make public transit work a lot better. We could get those vehicles moving around more efficiently. We could get them full of more people and make it easier for people to use. And so TransLoc today, our technology is in over 300 cities around the world. As was mentioned, the Obama administration honored me with the Champion of Change Award for it. Fast Company this year named TransLoc one of the top 10 most innovative companies in transportation, right next to Uber and Tesla. And one of the reasons why is because we're doing this cool thing in the past couple of years, after 12 years in business, which is we're helping public transit to work more like Uber and more like Lyft. So in other words, why do you always have to stand at a bus stop and then get on a bus that takes you on a fixed route? I don't know who said it, but there's this funny quip that public transit takes you from where you're not to where you don't want to be. And after a few years, public transit is finally ready and finally believing that they too can have apps and algorithms that do smart things for them. So we're helping them to make that transition so that we really can enjoy this low carbon mobility future together. What I want to call out specifically about that journey are a couple of peculiar points. One is that I had no expertise in the industry that I would ultimately help innovate in. So I was a computer science graduate, and I was an all-around geek, but I was not a transportation expert. And a lot of people reminded me of that in hopes that I would stop trying to start this company and do something else. But I really want to hone in on that point because all I really had was an experience. I had an experience that I was a transit rider waiting for the bus who never knew when it was really coming and who had to find some piece of paper somewhere that had some predicted times of when it might come. And again, I could compare that with the technology I was enjoying in other parts of reality, and I just had to trust that experience that something wasn't right, even though I wasn't a transit expert. And so often, the experts in an industry just become the keepers of all the excuses for why that industry is the way it is. And I want to just empower all of you that as consumers and humans just going about your lives, when you have an experience and you can kind of tell something's not right, maybe you're at an event and you have to throw everything away and there's no recycling and there's no composting, or you're sitting in traffic and you're sucking up poisonous fumes from the car in front of you. That is a valid experience, that moment you have when you say to yourself, this isn't right. And it doesn't matter how many experts are out there. The fact that you're still sitting there, still having that experience, makes you an authority and makes you capable of doing something about it. The other thing I want to call out, so the point there being I just would like everybody to believe in themselves a little more when you have these experiences and look around and say to yourselves, something isn't quite right, because very little is quite right in reality today, actually. So trust that instinct. The next point is that I actually founded TransLoc without any money. It's not because I thought that was the smartest thing to do, it's because I couldn't dream of anyone giving a 23-year-old any money. So the investment climate has changed. I was even a mentor in the Teal Foundation where we gave 20-year-olds $100,000 to pursue their dreams. So the culture changed pretty quickly. But 12 years ago, I didn't think anybody would give a 23-year-old any money. And so how did we start an infrastructure-heavy company without any money? Well, we went to these people called customers, and we said, hey, this is what we're building. It's going to be great. And we kept telling them about how great it was going to be and kept fielding their requests until they also believed it was going to be so great that they were willing to pay for it before it was finished. So I want to remind you that that is always a possibility as well, that you can create something so good that with such a good value proposition that your customers and clients will pay you for it. In essence, they will help you to bring it about. They will help you to create it. And then the last point I want to make is that this whole adventure of founding TransLoc did not leave me only mildly traumatized, but it also left me financially independent. And so I was able to make quite a bit of money doing this. So can you do well while also doing good? Absolutely, you can. In fact, I think with the state of the planet as it is today, we have no excuse for doing anything but doing well and doing good. We're running out of time. There's just no more room for doing things that are neutral or negative to the planet. So people tell me sometimes, wow, you've made it. And there's a few other people in the room who have made it, looking at my panelists up there. Quote, made it. And what do you do once you've made it? Well, what I've concluded is you become either, you're at a crossroads. You either become a more ridiculous person specializing in ever greater luxuries, or you become a superhero. And what I mean by a superhero is you go about doing the jobs that no one gets paid to do, or that it's not clear how they're going to be solved, or it's not clear how anyone's going to make money. I think that's the responsibility of anyone who becomes financially independent, to go looking for those jobs and those challenges in society that it's not clear one could make a living doing. I have a little meditation these days that helps me stay on that mode of thinking. It's a bit of a downer, but it'll only last a minute. One is, I think, what will happen, where I'll be and what I'll be thinking when I hear that some nuclear weapon has gone off and taken a city off the face of the earth. I'm pretty sure that I'll stop at that moment and I'll ask myself, what have you been doing up to this point? Have I been doing anything that mattered? Have I been doing everything I could? Could I have done more? Could I have done differently to avert that catastrophe? The other thing I think of is that in maybe 30 years, money won't even exist. Not only have I been a tech entrepreneur working my ass off to make a living and make money, I've also been a cryptocurrency investor who, with several single clicks of my mouse and type of my keyboard, made just about as much money as I've made as an entrepreneur. It's really weird out there today. There's kids printing money, okay? When I did that as a young person, we got in a lot of trouble, okay? Today, you're a genius. So they're not just printing money, they're printing the mint. They're creating whole mints. And so there's hundreds and hundreds of cryptocurrencies out there right now. And so it's fascinating. It's the evolution of money for sure. But it also leaves you wondering, wait a minute, maybe money isn't real. And so that's kind of a disturbing thought. But I like it. I think to myself, in 30 years, I don't want to be sitting on a pile of money that we then realize isn't real and that nobody cares about anymore. I want to have spent all of that money up to that point on protecting the only living biosphere in the known universe. Because money is just voltage, and so apply that voltage now when we need it. And that is what I'm doing with the rest of my life for the near foreseeable future that I can see. I am launching interventions into protecting the biosphere, regenerating ecosystems, and elevating human consciousness. Why do I mention human consciousness? Well, let's look at this authoritative chart of consciousness that I made up this morning in my hotel room. There's no awareness of destroying the planet. Then there's another level of consciousness, which is where we consider not destroying the planet. Then there's where we try to stop destroying the planet. And then there's where we work to regenerate the planet. And of course, humanity is a bell curve, and there's people existing at all points of this spectrum. But society in general, or as an average, is pretty much down at the first two rungs still. And that's the problem. The more I think about consciousness, the more I think about, people ask me why you started TransLoc. Why did you start TransLoc as a 23-year-old? I could have done a bunch of things. And I've given a lot of answers over the years, and I find myself increasingly giving this one answer that feels true, and that's very strange. And I say, I just felt sorry for those buses. That's what I tell people. Because I can imagine that there was a forest somewhere, and there was a mountain somewhere, and we cut down the forest, and we blew up the mountain, and we yanked all this metal out of the ground, and we turned it into this bus, which nobody really thinks looks that good, and it's noisy and smelly, and it gets 3 miles per gallon, and it goes up and down the street empty. And I think just subconsciously, I felt sorry for all those buses, and I thought the least we could do, having done that to the planet, is fill them up with people and get some cars off the road. And so I feel that a lot, actually, whenever I have to throw something away when it can't be recycled or reused, I actually feel a little bit of pain in my gut because it just doesn't seem like a good thing to do to this planet that gave birth to us and evolved us. And I've taken to calling that Earth empathy. I think I actually empathize with the planet. Maybe I've spent too much time in California, but it seems like a living thing to me. And so now I'm empathizing with this living thing called the planet. And I think if we can spread Earth empathy, then we won't need so many charts and graphs and numbers about gigatons of CO2, because to be honest, none of those are what got me into this to begin with. I just felt sorry for the planet. There's also ecosystem consciousness. I've had some fruitless online debates with my friends, and at one point I realized that this guy I was arguing with about some subtle thing about economics and nature, I realized that this guy didn't know what an ecosystem actually was. All he knew is he had a park down the street and it had a couple trees and a couple shrubs, and that was a good day, as far as he could tell. And then I realized ecosystem consciousness is also a thing. When you see a forest being bulldozed, you either see a few shrubs being taken away and a few trees being knocked down, or you see countless species being eradicated, you see mycelium being destroyed, you see bacteria being destroyed, you see ecosystem diversity being lost. And there might be something important in that forest, and you see how it will take a long time for that amount of diversity to come back and that amount of complexity to come back. So I care about consciousness. I'm getting close to wrapping up here, but a couple other things that I've done. One was to start an urban farm in Raleigh, North Carolina. There's a 1-acre urban farm there. And the point of that was to give as many people as possible the experience of watching plants grow and then feed them. Even though we could go to the store and buy food, I began to realize that planting a seed was a metaphor people used, and it was an experience they almost never had. And then when I finally had that experience, it actually shifted my consciousness. When I planted a seed, when I tended to the plant for several months, and when I ate the food that came from it, it actually shifted my consciousness. Again, about experts, when I brought farmers there to this abandoned 1-acre lot a mile from city center that had very little soil and a lot of smashed up concrete, and I said to all of them, I'm going to do a farm here. And they said to me, can't you do it somewhere else? It was the worst farmland and the most expensive farmland they'd ever considered. And so again, my friends and I who started it, they said, we're not urban farming experts. And I said, no one is. In 3 months, we will be. So that's the way we need to be thinking, is that when it comes to regenerating and saving the planet, no one's really an expert. Your opinion and your insights and anything you see for how to make the planet more beautiful is just as valid as anyone else's. Another project of mine now is called Make Soil, makesoil.org. You can go there and you can take a look at it. And it's a way to bring people together to turn their food scraps and waste into compost together. Most of the world's food waste goes into the landfill, where it's just going to putrefy for hundreds of years. And within a matter of weeks instead, all that same waste could be turned into jet black soil and giving birth to new life. And there's a few municipal compost pickup programs in the country. They're increasing, but the majority of the planet's food is wasted and taken to landfills to this day. And furthermore, I'm realizing that, again, people coming together, creating soil together, this is one of the first occurrences they've ever had in their experience set of watching the planet go through a regenerative act. So I want to just underscore how important it is. It seems like such a humble thing, but part of why we're having trouble getting anyone to take care of the planet is because there are these essential feedback loops inside of us that aren't being completed. We're not actually watching the planet provide for us, and we're not actually watching and seeing how human life can actually be harmonized with living ecosystems. So I'm very interested in completing those essential feedback loops inside of human beings, allowing our consciousness to elevate, and then we don't have to chase people around with such colorful graphs all the time. Lastly, I tried to sum up the problem in one tweet. Took me a lot of time to get all the characters right. Tech people love money, money people love tech, neither understands nature, and nature lovers fear money and tech. And all you have to do to fix the planet is resolve this. And it's true, I spent a lot of time, you can probably tell I'm a little bit strange of an individual, but I spent a lot of time hiding the fact that I'd made any money at the eco-doer potlucks I went to, and then hiding the fact that I cared about nature from the finance people I hung out with, and so on and so forth. All we have to do is stop boxing ourselves into all these categories of I'm this, I'm that, I'm the other, and just realize we're human beings, we're in this together, and that you have the intelligence to regenerate the planet and care about all these things and benefit from all these things. Thanks so much.
think we know why you're described as an enlightenment explorer as well as an eco-entrepreneur there. Thank you for that incredible presentation. I'd like to ask Danny to come back up because I'm going to go to Danny because Jigar needs to go be part of the climate economy right this moment for a few minutes, right? Yeah. So excuse Jigar for a second and ask Danny this question. And perhaps this will kick you further than the question and give you a chance to give us a little more on this. But you were an activist at one point. What Josh just really said is stop putting us in boxes, so I think it's a perfect time for me to put you in a box and say you were an activist at one point, you became an entrepreneur. Maybe you were an entrepreneur while you were an activist. Can you say something about that? If what we're trying to do is seed more entrepreneurs, and in this movement there's a lot of activists, how do you do that? How do you go from activist to entrepreneur? How did you do it?
Sure. Should I take this opportunity to give my words?
Yes, of course.
More generally, and answer that question as I go. I have some notes.
Excellent.
I'll try to address the question and cover off a couple of points I wanted to make just about seeding and growing entrepreneurship in the climate economy. And as was mentioned, I was an activist. I proudly have been arrested on several continents and done my time with Greenpeace and other organizations and learned a lot, and a lot that was very relevant to being an entrepreneur. So the most direct answer to the question is simply that the mentality is very similar. It's basically not taking no for an answer and doing a lot with a little. You know, like an entrepreneur is kind of your classic startup guy or gal, you know, and so is an activist. You know, they take on, say in the case of Greenpeace, the organization I worked for over a decade of my life, you know, the whaling industry, which at the time in 1971 was this incumbent that was just untouchable. You know, business as usual was killing whales. That's what we did as humans. And wherever there were whale populations running up and down coasts, there were people killing them for oil, which was really just dumb. And these hippies in Canada at the time said, that's bad, and we're going to change that. And a generation later, like in 1971, the year of my birth, had you polled the human population, 90+% of them would have said, killing whales is fine. Russians, Japanese, South Africans, Australians, they'd all made fortunes out of killing whales. In a generation, if you polled the population today, 90+% of humans would say, killing whales is bad, it's dumb. And the better thing to do is to go and enjoy them and appreciate planet Earth and its wonders and these mammals that swim off our coasts and are probably much smarter than us. And we have made businesses which are much more valuable than the whale killing business was in 1971. The whale watching industry today is worth billions of dollars more than the net present value of what was then the whale killing industry. So, you know, like an activist and an entrepreneur to me are sort of interchangeable things, and I'm no less an activist today than I am just because I've spent 10 years wearing fancy clothes. These are fancy clothes, by the way. So that goes a little bit to what I wanted to say, which was that, you know, I want to make sure we understand that growing and seeding climate economy entrepreneurship, which was the subject of this pitch session or Spark session, is an exercise in both public policy and private enterprise. And it requires activists and entrepreneurs. It requires politicians and leaders of all walks of life to get involved. I'm a big believer in something called the entrepreneurial state. If you've ever read that book, you'd know what I mean. It's written by a woman called Mariana Mazzucati, and it kind of documents those countries and states like California, like Vermont, that are intentional about seeding and growing industries that they want, and how that is a practice that the populations that do well on this earth, by which I mean take care of many and not the few and have better environments to live in and so forth, tend to be pretty intentional about this business of seeding and growing entrepreneurship. And in our case, we're grappling with the issue of how to do that around this so-called climate economy, which is solving this ridiculous problem we have from fossil fuel consumption over the last couple hundred years. Mind you, it was only a couple hundred years. I mean, one of the big things that I remind people is, as addicted as we are to fossil fuels, you know, per Alcoholics Anonymous, you have to walk as far out of the woods as you walked into them, but we can walk faster. We can accelerate the process out of the forest of addiction to fossil fuels by accelerating clean energy businesses, by accelerating regenerative businesses like making soil, like doing organic farming and all the rest of it that we've heard about here today at a faster rate. And that's really what I want to get to. It's not just seeding, but it's growing quickly the clean energy and climate economy. And that's what we do at the California Clean Energy Fund, very intentionally in California, and then, like you've talked about Vermont as a lab for the United States, we think of California as a lab for the world, where much of what we've done has been successful in shifting and decoupling our economic activity from our energy consumption and carbon production, and we want to share those lessons with the world through the California Clean Energy Fund and a program we call New Energy Nexus, which is what I was going to tell you about. But just to dimensionalize it a bit, because I like sort of trying to stay real and give you some goals, I talked at the opening panel about $1 trillion worth of value creation in this climate economy annually, $1 trillion. Just to do sort of thought experiment, a numbers game with that, that's $1,000 billion businesses. I don't know whether Stonyfield's in the room. You know, I can't remember how big Stonyfield is these days, but I hope it's $1 billion business. I'm not sure it is. You know, if you think about your favorite clean economy, climate economy business, say you're fans of Elon Musk, you know, what's Elon done? He probably does $1 billion worth of revenue annually. He's got a $50 billion valuation. Let's say his valuation is a real measure of his company. It's a $50 billion valuation. You need 20 Elon Musk success stories annually every year for the next 25 years. And it's taken him a decade to build that $50 billion business. So, you know, you need 20 of those, or more likely, you need 1,000 billion-dollar businesses. And to build a billion-dollar business, I've built a couple that have gone to hundreds of millions of dollars of scale. I've been involved at the founding of Mosaic, for example, which is going to do $1 billion worth of debt this year in the solar market. It's hard yards. It takes a long time. Most of your peers will fail along the way. So we have to create, in order to succeed at building 1,000 billion-dollar businesses annually, tens of thousands to try. Because 90% of them will fail, not because they're bad ideas. There's plenty of good ideas. They will fail because of someone else, or something else, or some execution challenge, or capital not being at the right place at the right time at the right cost. They will fail for personal reasons, for trucks and buses running into founders. They will fail for a range of things that I've seen in my lived experience as being an entrepreneur. And so in order to have success, we need to try many, many different things, and particularly in the markets that matter. And that's not to say we in Vermont or California don't matter, but we're really the experimental zones to get right the e-home and the distributed generation network and the system, and then share that with the world, where there's billions of people waiting for electricity at all, let alone clean electricity, and there's billion more coming down the line through population growth and all the rest of it, who will want and take electricity service and mobility for granted just as we do. So we have to share all that technology, know-how, execution, brilliance with them rapidly in accelerators. And so that's what we're doing with the New Energy Nexus. We basically are trying to seed 100 ecosystems like this Accelerate VT that have the buy-in of the establishment, the status quo, the great and good of a place, that commit to supporting entrepreneurs to succeed, and by which I mean not just throwing a bit of cash at them, cash is a commodity, by providing them with the support, the mentoring, the therapy that they'll need to survive the roller coaster of a startup, the peer coaching that they will really thrive through, and the lawyers that they need to protect their IP and to form their corporations, and the other human capital requirements. And those incubators, those ecosystems, they become these hotbeds of activism of a kind, of entrepreneurship, which then will have a synergistic value, which is hard to describe, but it's basically the network effect. There is, you know, a value that is greater than the sum of the parts. What we're trying to do with the New Energy Nexus is seed many of these ecosystems, like what you're building here in Vermont, but again in Asia and Africa, which are these huge, demanding, burgeoning markets. And then we're trying to network them, because there's a rule in innovation which shows that for every doubling of the population focused on an innovation problem, you get a tripling of the rate of innovation. It's sort of a human relationship characteristic. It's also coined as Metcalfe's law. It's the value of the network is actually the square of the nodes in the network. And we see that all the time as we push more people together, and they have what we call creative collisions. Just by co-locating, literally in a building, you have an entrepreneur walk into another entrepreneur and say, oh, you know, I've been struggling with so-and-so as an angel and he doesn't understand my business model, and, oh, you know, tell him this and he'll give you the investment. Or I need an algorithm that can pass through public transit, first and last mile needs for my electric scooter business. Oh, by the way, there's a computer scientist down the hall that built algorithms like that as a career and is now giving something back in his career. All that sort of co-location and magic that happens is what we're trying to foster at scale so that we can build 100 ecosystems of this kind to spit out 100,000 startups over the next decade. Because 90% of them will fail, but we'll have 10,000 out the other end who hopefully will grow to be billion-dollar businesses to deliver on some measure of that $1 trillion annually we need to make this clean energy transition. Josh's talk and the first slides reminded me of why we called the first company I started Sanjivani. We made the word up. We actually claimed that Arthur C. Clarke did and put that in Wikipedia, and it was there for about 3 months until some editor came along and banned me from ever entering anything in Wikipedia again. But we said that Sanjivani was the period for which life is possible, because as was noted, you know, the only place we know there is life is planet Earth, and it's because of our sun. And our sun will burn up and disappear in 10 to the 5 billion years. And weirdly, there is no word for that epoch in our language. There is no word. There's perpetuity and eternity, but there is none for the period for which life itself will exist. And that is what we have to think about, of course, the 7th generation and so on. And I am 100% confident that the 2nd generation from now, or certainly the 3rd, will be 100% solar powered. I have no question that in 2100, we will be basically 100% solar powered civilization. By the way, I am claiming water and wind in solar powered because wind is just exchanging heat across the planet's surface and water power is just the hydrologic cycle which is driven by the sun. But it's solar power. We're going to stop burning solar power buried underground in the form of fossil fuels, and we're going to shift our civilization to a solar powered civilization in a very short period of time, actually, shorter than we've been stuck on the fossil fuel dependency that we have today, which has been a couple of 100 years. We'll do it in about 100 or less, hopefully, to avert the worst of climate change. I have no question we can do that. We have the technology, as they say. We have the money. It's about more than $6 million. And you know, the question is political will and whether or not we seed and accelerate these entrepreneurs to deliver on that fast enough. That is the challenge. That's the topic of the conversation. Really happy to be part of it with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. I have questions, but I want to ask the audience for questions. And if you have one, just raise your hand. I don't know if we have our sound guy still, so you may need to belt it out. But if something's burning, please come forward. Raise your hand and I'll recognize you from the podium. I'm curious, Josh, you talked about TransLoc a little in your experience there. As a rural state, somebody that lives in a rural state and somebody that used to work at USDA Rural Development, we talked a lot about the potential for rural transit to be a fantastic entrepreneurship opportunity for somebody. Have you had any experience in that? Have you seen something doing a successful mass transit in urban areas, in rural areas? Sorry.
Definitely. There's a huge opportunity there, especially with an on-demand kind of model. And what the little wrinkle people run up against right now is that public transit has largely been federally funded, and there's this kind of 100% accessibility kind of mandate with any federal dollars, and so there's been this real or mythical person who may not have a smartphone, and therefore we can't run the system on demand. And so instead of knocking on people's doors and giving them a smartphone, we send them a 40-foot bus in case they want to take it. So you just run into things like that. They're not going to last forever, but that's one of the things that there's a lot of people involved trying to do the right thing, and those will dissolve over time into something more elegant. But yeah, that's going to change rural transit a lot.
And just curious, do you consider yourself an activist, as Danny said, all entrepreneurs may be?
Yeah, I got in a lot of trouble once when I was a young entrepreneur, and I sat down with this investor who chastised me that I was carrying a book on philosophy to my investor meeting instead of like Crossing the Chasm or whatever I was supposed to be reading. And so I think I read 2 business books in my entire life. I can't remember them. I read the cover to Crossing the Chasm, and that's great. It shows you the chart. Otherwise, I was reading Gandhi and Thoreau during my entrepreneurial life. So,
excellent. Any questions from the audience? Please, Kathy. Just so the back of the room can hear, a different way to think about the slice of our housing stock that's electric heat or fossil fuel heat, period?
No, I'm specifically talking about condominiums that have separate ownership.
All right, multi-unit condos that have separate ownership, and how to come up with an energy solution for that type of housing stock.
Each owner has a different economic interest.
The split incentives. I could use a couple of different observations from the Californian experience, but the main one I'd offer is to the point of the entrepreneurial state, that we have a building code in California and a piece of it called Title 24 that basically ratchets up every 3 years the requirements of new buildings, such that by 2020, all new build homes will be zero net energy. By 2025, all commercial buildings, and 2030, all public buildings. So, our building stock by 2030 will be zero net energy. And what we're relying on there, that was set in train in the 1970s under our now Governor Brown, when he was first-time Governor Brown. And the point I'm trying to make is the magic of a little bit of vision and a bit of long-term policy trim tabbing. At the time, it wasn't seen as too excessive meddling in the building business and developers' work, but it just required this uplift, and it's resulted in this remarkable phenomenon where California, with its 40 million population growing annually, growing economy, et cetera, is going to be in a situation where just over a decade out, every new build is going to be zero net, which means that 50 years out, as those buildings go through their lifetime, talk about the end of the utility, and the need for e-homes and only distribution to arbitrage electrons between producers and consumers, mainly being your car and the garage, because the buildings will be built such that they're zero net energy, and that's the law of the land in this massive economy and market with 100,000 new starts annually or something in that order. So, the point there, I guess, is a bit of hindsight, sorry for that, but long-term policy setting works and is really driving change. I will say that, what I forgot in my little reaction to your question about my activism and entrepreneurialism, if you're not activist and you're an entrepreneur, I'm sorry, it's probably not going to work out for you. You need to get active. Our markets are set by policy and regulation, and they are creatures and they are craven to corruption and all the problems we see at the federal level in this country right now. And if we're not organizing as entrepreneurs, we will lose that battle. The incumbents are very powerful. We insurgents are few, and we have to demonstrate our value to the community in many more ways than just making money for investors and people like me and others that do this business. We have to do it for jobs and better outcomes, better housing for folk in places in low income and elsewhere. We really have to build a bridge. The good news is, and I'm sorry I'm waxing a little bit from your question, but and it does speak to your question, the condominiums, I'm not sure what their population is, but I truly believe that our solution of clean energy businesses that we're talking about seeding and growing through entrepreneurship here is both the solution to climate issues as much as we can solve them, although they're already upon us, and to the inequity in our society that is driving the extremism, populism at the political level. Like, if you don't understand that the swing to the right, or whatever we call the neo-Nazis in the streets of Charlottesville and everything else, as a response to a stagnant economy that has failed to deliver for many Americans, then you don't understand history. You know, it's almost, it's entirely inevitable that will happen, and predictable. You know, Weimar Germany, Bolshevik Russia, when you have stagnant economies that deliver only to the rich and not to the many, you have extremism emerge and demagogues take advantage of it, and populism in the streets and blaming victims and all the rest of it. And that will continue unless we solve for that. The good news is our businesses employ more people, can be distributed by their very nature and architecture. They put the generating assets in the hands of the people, at the home, at the business. They are labor dense versus capital dense, just by their nature. You know, between 3 and 7 times as many jobs per kilowatt hour of electricity from wind and solar versus fossil fuel-based electricity, for example. And we can deliver those benefits throughout the community and resist. But we can only do that if we get organized, which is why I would compel you to join Vote Solar, which is one of the organizations sponsoring here. I happen to be on the board, so fair warning, but in full disclosure, I kind of want people to get to know that they have to stay organized and continue to demand the regulations. And the good news about seeding an entrepreneurial ecosystem, as we're talking about here in Vermont, is it's this virtuous spiral where you have the entrepreneurs employ people, those employees become a base to become a voice for better policy setting. The politicians start to follow. They like the announceables and the ribbon cutting ceremonies at the projects and the new businesses. And then that creates better policies which drive more demand and attract more entrepreneurs and more businesses, and it flows. And I think that will happen. And we'll then come to the point where we can address your condominium problem, which I think is one of innovation and entrepreneurship. The technologies probably exist to weatherize and retrofit and upgrade those businesses. Someone just needs to make a business case that, you know, Mary or one of the utilities or Jigar should come in and just asset finance the fuck out of it and do all those condominiums and recoup the money. And I mean, we can't be talking about more than, you know, tens of thousands of people. That's a great investment that will probably pay back in a decade. Do that.
Kathy, can you be sure that, thank you. Did you have a reaction, Josh? Or?
No, it seemed pretty wise and comprehensive.
Val, I see a hand back here, then here, and then here. Val. Good luck.
I think I'll leave the Uber evaluation and expected return to you, and address kind of the question of change. I've been consumed by that question for the longest time. When I was in my early 20s, I just had this observation that I still can't really convey the profundity of, which is that we get born here on Earth, and then something happens, and we either end up rich and famous, or kind of normal, and just staying out of jail and paying your taxes, or in jail and being treated like an animal. And it's just the diversity of what happens to us once we get here is incredible, and I've always wondered what those drivers are. And then one of the conclusions I came to were just that the people, again, studying the life of Gandhi, people like that, who started off quite ordinary and not exceptional by any observation, and then who end up exceptional and paradigm shifters. And just realizing that they realized that they could essentially reprogram themselves and change their beliefs and change their identity and continue to adapt. And so sometimes there's no industry. I mean, I don't know where to. I've spent as much time studying psychology, spirituality, and health and nutrition as I have computer science, because the answer to this question is so vast. There's people out there who don't have the neuroplasticity to update their beliefs because they don't have any omega-3s in their diet, for example. So it's such an interesting problem, and that's why I am focused on the elevation of consciousness now of human beings, because it's a holistic problem. Sometimes it's nutritional, sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's familial. Everybody's walking around with tons of bad experiences in the bottom of their mind, in their subconscious, that make them fearful about change. I used to joke that I would become president just to create a therapy tax credit or something. Like, I'll give you a $100,000 tax credit, but it's only good for therapy. So I hear you, and I think about this all day long, so thank you.
I'll take on the other one, not how to change society, but what to do with Uber. Nearly as big, but not probably as important or profound. I don't know enough about the business to say much about their returns. I'm not sure that that's why Travis lost his job. It might be that he's a bit of an asshole, but
Beep.
I don't know. I will say, to your point, there's a trap in venture capital for the transition we're talking about, which is that we don't do 10Xs in 10 years, broadly speaking. And so there's a broader message in this that's serious, which is, as Vermont seeks to become this lab and attract these accelerator candidates and all the rest of it, if you think the measure of that is how much VC you have here, think again. Be careful of VCs. I mean, this is funny for me to say because I run a fund in California and I spend a lot of time with people on Sand Hill Road and so on, and I'm fairly frank with them about it too. They have laws and demands from their LPs, which are these ridiculous expectations that do not really fit business. They kind of fit a myth of business from the late 20th century, early 21st century in California that was software and internet-based companies that could get 10x returns in short periods of time. But if you think about how businesses have been grown for thousands of years across hundreds of cultures, it's mostly bootstrapping and a bit of debt, friends, families, fools, and then the bank, and we have come to pretend that like the American experience of this small nepotistic subset around Stanford is the model for the world. That is not true, and it certainly is not the case that energy will be transited to fully clean energy systems with sharing and public transit and sensible mobility services in the sorts of timeframes with the kinds of returns those investors demand. So we have to have a range of investment capital to flow. I mean, money is like water. It comes in different forms, falling from the sky and in pockets and pools and ponds and cisterns on your toilet. And I'm not sure which of those the VCs inhabit, but just don't depend on them entirely for your water. I do think, to the point about the gig economy and Uber's model, and again, I'm not so sure about it. It's not one I've studied too closely, but I don't use it because I don't love the way they treat workers in that economy. And I'm worried about the casualization and contractualization of labor, which the gig economy is a cool word for, which has contributed to and driven this inequality in our society, which in turn has led to the entirely inevitable extremism, populism, and swing to the right of our politics. So when we design for this clean energy and clean mobility transition, we have to design for businesses that take care of people and allow a middle class in America and the rest of the world and pay people fairly and do not just enrich the few who had the clever idea and were computer scientists and created the algorithm for the car sharing app, but rather for the many who did the work of it. And if we're not designing for that at the outset, we will end up where we're going. And where we're going right now, per the opening slide of this session, is not a great place. I'm not worried about planet Earth surviving, but I do think the flea on its back called humans has a time stamp on it unless we get with the program and resolve those conflicts we have between ourselves and design energy systems that can drive our economy and give us daily activity and mobility and the things we require, entertainment, information, without killing one another.
Thank you. I have to keep moving, Val, because I got 2 more questions in 4 minutes. Give me.
John Newsom at Middlebury. I'm delighted, Josh, to hear you talk about meeting Gandhi and Thoreau. That's what we do with liberal arts. And I also love this analogy of the bus. And it speaks to me now. I think there's a lot of classrooms that have few people in their life that helps. So to both of you, what can we do better now as we train these millennials? I think we're doing some good things, including still assigning Thoreau. And innovation and entrepreneurship are starting to be part of the curriculum. But when young folks come your way, are there moments where you say, man, I wish this kid had been trained in X? If so, what is that X?
Yeah, so there's this great quote, I don't know who it's by, but any real-world solution is interdisciplinary, right? And so you look at the struggle that the current university and educational structures have to get, like, the psychology department and the philosophy department to do a crossover class, or to get the, when I went into school, I literally had to figure out whether I was a designer with some aesthetic sense or an engineer who could abdicate all design sensibilities. And that's what they did to us back then, and because the departments didn't work together. And so it just needs to be as holistic as possible. We need to be teaching not, what people actually need to know, not just what the faculty happens to know. There was one other point, and then there's just this broader point, which is that when you put a child in school at first, they start off saying, "I can do it, let me do it." They want to take the shovel and dig a hole. They can barely hold the shovel. You check on them six years later, and they say, "What do you want me to do?" And so the curiosity and ingenuity is our birthright. It is innate, and it needs to stop being broken by these institutions.
Sort of building on that, the thought I had when you asked the question, and I'm a parent of 2 millennials, I think they're millennials, 1999 and 2001, that's millennial, right? Is help them have fun. I actually worry about this up-and-coming generation. I think there's a lot of weight when we talk about this stuff on their shoulders, and it's not a fun time to be alive. We've got loathsome people in leadership, truly horrific humans that have probably never heard of Gandhi, let alone read Thoreau.
Swear. Please don't swear.
I won't swear, but like shameful, misogynist, retro throwbacks to all that was bad. And we got nuclear conflagration back on the deck as a likely possibility in our lifetimes, which we thought we'd got rid of. And we got, cyclones lining up in the Caribbean like it's a bowling alley. It's a rough time to be a kid. And I think they've got a lot of stress, ranging from the social networks and stuff they're under for peer pressure and the demands on school success and so on. And, having grown up in the 80s in Australia, I knew my teenage was the best time of my life. And my daughters I worry about. Like, I want them to enjoy themselves, have fun, stay curious, stay young, get drunk, do stupid things, and work out what it means to be in this world with other humans to resolve these conflicts, to create these solutions that we need that are not based on some meritocracy measured in how rich you are. That is everything we learned not to be in the 20th century. And yet that seems to be the way we've started the 21st.
I hate to say this, or maybe that's a great place to leave it, because that's all we have time for. I apologize to our last question. I want to thank Danny and Josh, and really thank the audience for the participation, and make sure you get to your next pitch session or Spark at 2:30. Have a great afternoon.